From Toronto, Charlie Francis, that's pretty well known. Matt Nickel here you knew him very well, sorry. And he was Ben Johnson's coach. And I learned one thing from Charlie I'll never forget. We'd be on the track with a table, and these guys would come, and they're doing their warm-ups and everything, and you go, dude, you gotta go home, man. I'm like, Charlie, what are you talking about? And he's dehydrated. It's a waste of time for me to train, for him to train today. And that was the first guy that I ever saw. He could recognize it from a distance, and he wouldn't even initiate a workout until they were metabolically ready to handle what he was going to do. So the second person that was an influence was Dan Papp, maybe the brightest power speed coach ever. I mean, this guy's unbelievable. He's got a PhD in human movement, and his whole thing, I worked with him with Don Bailey and Marion Jones and some of the other sprinters. His whole thing was, you're building a battery, Mark. It's all the neurochemistry that you're working with. It's not trying to make really someone stronger. It's affecting neurochemistry. And I'm like, I didn't really understand what he was talking about back then, but now I do. So what's the point of doing activation? The point is, right at the bottom here, is to change the central integrative state of the cortex, because 90% of brain function is inhibitory. It's not activity, it's inhibition. And the only way you have motion is when you have inhibition of the inhibition. So we'll get into that. So one of the perspectives that I've really changed in the last 20 years is the repetition aspect of treatment. And this gets into the whole area of neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity, in the simplest form, means efficiency. So the more you fire a synapse, the more efficient the transmission of that impulse becomes. If you don't fire the synapse, the neural pool becomes very unstable and it dies. And that's the way we're born. So we all live in gravity. And the receptors that fire into your brain, the fastest receptors, the interstates, if you will, the fast guys are the large diameter afferents. That's from muscle spindles, Golgi tendons, and mechanoreceptors. So these guys are firing 24/7, unconsciously. Even though you're not aware of it, that controls the tone of the muscle. So what's very interesting, Marco actually touched on this a little bit in the last talk, is the muscle spindle has the largest diameter afferents that go back to the cord, but they ascend from the spinal segment, unconscious and conscious proprioception. So the unconscious goes to the spinal cerebellar tract, cerebellum. The conscious goes to your parietal lobe, to your cortex, somatosensory cortex. Okay? So then you get a descending response that modulates the reflex. So most of the modulation is non-volitional. It's from the cerebellum. So I'm going to teach you 4 things if you just remember these things. So vestibulospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, and tectospinal tract. So everyone stand up. It's about efficiency. So the more you drive these cells, the more synaptically stable they become. So a good analogy of this is if you were sliding in the winter in deep snow, the first times you go down, it's a little bit slow, but the more you slide on the same path, the faster you're going to go. That's exactly how the neuron responds. So Dr. Eric Kandel, he's at Columbia University in New York. He won a Nobel Prize on this exact concept of driving synaptic activity to create, that's the learning response. That's creating the connectome, if you will. So how does this work in our world? So if you have a peripheral receptor that fires into the central processor, and you get a motor output. So as a clinician, we're looking at motor output in the form of eye movements, posture, gait, muscle strength, reflexes. Those are all motor outputs that we can look at as windows into brain function. Okay? What hockey is, the best players make plays, and they create space on the ice. and it's all about angles. So what happens is if you have a concussion, there's a direct pelvic consequence, because if you develop too much flexor tone, you can't amorticize or get ankle-knee flexion in the right timing. So if you combine that with, say, a high ankle sprain and a concussion, then you can't dorsiflex, and you have more flexor tone. So you're like this. So the whole goal is to train global multi-joint movements. In the cerebellum, as you move laterally, that's extremity movement. The cerebellum doesn't even light up on linear movement. So if you're riding a bike, the cerebellum doesn't even turn on. But if you're doing multiple joint compound movements in space, that's what drives your frontal lobe. So you can be brain dead just riding a bike. One of the big problems in the Tour de France is these guys get osteoporotic because there's no information. They're not touching the ground. So I'm just going to, the epitome of reflexogenic movement is Usain Bolt. I mean, it's effortless for this guy to run because he's in the right place at the right time. It's effortless. It's a push. At full speed, it's a push, the quad stretches, and it comes up. He's not initiating hip flexion. There's tons of studies showing the psoas doesn't even activate at full speed. It's crazy. So that's why it looks like he's not even trying. This thing is just perpetual. Okay? So the reason I'm showing this is I want to show you the other extreme. What happens when you get old? What track lights up? Flexion. Because you're losing the ability to inhibit the tone of flexion. As you age, your frontal lobe starts to go down. And this is the whole essence of why you need to understand central function for pelvic lower extremity function. So the fastest guys in the world are in the air longer than the other guys. They have a higher vertical displacement. All they're doing is that. See the extension? Now the hip flexor is obviously firing here because you're driving out of the blocks, but once he gets to full speed, this thing just turns.
Mark, can I say something?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you'll finish. But what we're trying to bring together is that it doesn't matter what's hurt. It doesn't matter if it's an ankle injury, a knee injury, a shoulder injury, or back injury. And so we're trying to get across the fact, if you heard it this morning, this central processor problem. It's a brain injury. All injuries are brain injuries. And once